Welcome to another installment of Monday Q&A. I hope you've all had a fantastic weekend. Hope you got to make some fun guitar noises, and I hope you're looking forward to a great week. Some fun videos coming up this week on the channel. But first, I want to say thank you to everybody who supports me over on Patreon. All of you have gone and checked out the new Ragdoll single, Sky's Limit. And to everybody who continues to watch these videos, subscribe to the channel, like my videos, leave comments. I always look forward to hearing from all of you. And of course, to everybody who submitted a question last week, I'm going to do my best to get to as many of those as I can. If you have a question you would like me to answer on next week's Monday Q&A, simply put it in the comments section below. You can check the links in the video description to support my channel or get yourself some fun free stuff. So without further ado, let's go. My thoughts on Jackson guitars. I don't own any Jackson guitars, but I definitely went through a Jackson guitars phase as a teenager. I remember the Rhodes V, the Kelly, and the Soloist being particularly desirable when I was really sort of getting into metal and shred guitar, I think because so many of my favorite players and bands were associated with them at some point. I think if it's a choice between a sort of Jackson Soloist or a Kelly or one of their cool shapes and maybe the, say, more traditional super stratty Charvel thing, I think these days I tend to gravitate towards stuff like the SoCal and the San Dimas. Having said that, I watched the Brandon Ellis guitar tour not too long ago, and all those like custom crackle Jacksons that Brandon has, they look amazing. One of my students, shout out to Nath, also has a really, really lovely USA-made Jackson that I played recently, and it kind of helped me reconnect with what I liked about those guitars when I finally got to play them in my teens. And I can totally understand why there are some true Jackson fanatics out there. So I'd actually love to try one. Maybe I need to borrow one and use it on the channel and talk about what I dig about it, what I would change about it. Let me know if you're a Jackson Guitars fan and what you're playing in the comments. Updates for the Axe-Fx. Do the current firmware updates work on the older units, or are they only for the current generation units? They are only for the current generation units at the moment. Having said that though, when the Axe-Fx 3 came out, I think around 2019, the Axe-Fx 2 still got some pretty significant updates after that, which is pretty unprecedented for companies doing that kind of thing. A lot of the time, companies like, if you're looking at a company like Boss, they just seem to release a unit and they might put out a few bug fixes, but it's pretty rare that they actually add any significant new functionalities. So I thought that was pretty amazing when the Axe 3 launched, that the Axe 2 actually got some of those modeling improvements from the Axe 3 ported over, which they didn't have to do. The unit had been out for about 8 years at that stage, but it still got some significant updates. And I've got some students who have Axe-Fx 2s and they still use that firmware in there that has some of the cool stuff from the Axe 3, and they love it. It's still a fantastic unit. So one of the nice things about having a current generation unit is that when they put out updates, and with Fractal, one of the great things about the updates is there's always cool new stuff. For example, the recent Dynacabs, or you get new effects or new effect types or new amp models. So it's nice to have all that kind of stuff. But again, the most important thing is that those units sound fantastic and that you can go out and buy one and basically never have to update it, and you can go and make music with it, which again is kind of the point. Speaking of Fractal, the FM3 Mark II came out last week. Thank you to everybody who went and checked out the videos that I did on that unit. I really appreciate people watching it and asking questions and contributing to the discussion there. One thing that I didn't mention in that video is that they still list for the same price as the Mark I FM3. Again, a kind of a very typical Fractal thing where they add all this extra functionality, and if you are already on the wait list for a Mark I FM3, well, you get the extra power and the bigger scribble strips and all the other things that have been added via free firmware updates. I think we're so well off at the moment with these units where it's really easy to forget how much something like an FM3 or an HX Stomp or an Ampero or a NUX Trident actually do. And the fact that these companies not only put these units out as pieces of hardware, but they often add significant free updates to them is amazing. It's so good for us as end users that all the so-called complaints that you see about different units really really it kind of comes down to splitting hairs. There has never been a better time to get into this environment, whether it is something like the Boss ME90, which is priced very, very well and adds a lot of features, or it's something like an Axe-FX 3 Turbo, which would replace several refrigerator-sized racks full of effects, switching systems, or amps. So I can understand that some people are going to jump into the comments and, add their 2 cents, but we always kind of have to remember that with any of these units, we're living in this golden age of guitar noise-making machines, and we should probably focus more on making the guitar noises than making noise about the guitar noise-making boxes. Something like that anyway. We talked about the best and worst boogies last week, and few really, really good pieces of information popped up on there. I had a lot of fun reading the comments about what people do and don't like about those amps and their personal favorite amps in that lineup. I definitely have to check out a dual caliber after reading all of that. But I didn't even mention how great their cabs are. I think everybody kind of agrees that those oversized 4x12s and 2x12s are pretty amazing for a lot of different styles, but particularly if you like rock and metal. So shout out to the Boogie cabs. But I was asked whether I had tried a Triple Crown yet. I haven't. The Triple Crown, the Badlander, and the new Mark 7 are high on my list of amps to try. Again, kind of sourcing these amps down here in Perth, which is pretty isolated in Australia, and then Australia, where we get everything significantly later than the rest of the world, is kind of tricky. So if you're in Perth and you own one of those amps and you don't mind lending it to me for a few days, I will happily do a video with one of those. The Triple Crown, particularly, there's a model in the Fractal. I think it's the second channel, which I think sounds really, really cool. The Badlander as well, kind of just being like a modded, tighter recto, really appeals to my sensibilities. And of course, the Mark 7, it's a new Mark amp. I really, really want to try that one. And while we're talking about the best and worst boogies, what about the best and worst Marshall amps? When I started thinking about this question, kind of made me realize how many classic Marshall amps there are. So if we go right back to the start, the JTM 45 and the so-called Bluesbreaker combo, absolutely classic, one of my favorite amps of all time for clean and edge of breakup stuff. I love it. I've got a reissue JTM 45, and I've played some amps based on that circuit recently by Achilles Amps. It just works. They don't quite sound as tight as like the classic Plexi or 2203 circuit, but they've got this beautiful bloom about them. And, like a Strat plugged straight into a JTM 45 with greenbacks is, that's just a vibe right there. So JTM 45, stone cold classic. If you've never played one before, do yourself a favor. Same thing goes for the 50 and 100 watt kind of super lead models, or the Plexis, however you want to talk about them. Maybe the greatest sounding rock amp I've ever played was at the Zen Amps Vault last year. The Zen Amps Vault, they had like every desirable amp ever, over 30 heads in there, a bunch of cabinets, so many speakers and mics. And, we spent the first day filming a lot of stuff there and playing a bunch of these great high gain amps. And there was some real great sounds in there. But then we plugged into, I think, a 71 Plexi, and that was just the sound. It was AC/DC, it was Van Halen, it was Led Zeppelin, it was like just all my favorite rock guitar tones were in that amp just by plugging in a Les Paul or a Strat and manipulating the onboard controls on there. It was, again, a real kind of bucket list experience for me. Out of all those amps, I would probably personally go with like a 50 watt Plexi, because the difference between 50 watts and 100 watts in terms of raw output isn't that much, but you can kind of drive them harder. And then some of my favorite players use 50 watt amps, so there's that aesthetic in there as well. Obviously, the 2203 circuit is classic as well. I would love to get an old 2204 at some point. Again, the 50 watt thing, Michael Schenker, so many of my other favorite players doing that kind of thing. One thing that I think a lot of people who've never played those amps don't realize is that, they're great rock amps, but they don't have an insane amount of gain. They're not a modern high gain amp. So, when you talk about Marshall, it's always those amps that enter the discussion. A few other great ones that I've played. I love the JCM 2000 DSL, in particular the DSL 50. Ryan, singer and bass player from Ragdoll, has a great sounding DSL 50 that I've done a lot of recording with. I would say, in terms of bang for your buck with a modern Marshall, the DSLs, the original JCM 2000 ones, I know I had some issues with circuit board things, but the ones I've had have been great. You can just use them as a great gigging amp, They may never be the most amazing sound you've ever had in your life, but they're never going to sound too bad or too inappropriate. So I've had them a lot as backline amps, and I really, really like those. The 30th anniversary is pretty cool as well. I played one of those not too long ago. The JVM I finally got to try recently and was really impressed by. So I would say in terms of like a modern Marshall, the JVM 410 is just stellar. And the Joe Satriani version is really, really good as well. I did a podcast and interview with Santiago Alvarez recently, which I think you should all check out because Santiago designed the JVM as well as the AFD, the Kerry King Marshall, the YJM as well. And that was such a wellspring of information. I'd still like to try some of the kind of forgotten Marshalls as well. Like, what was it? Like I can't remember if it was the JTM 60 or the JCM 600 and some of those kind of things. I wasn't really that into the TSL. I've got one of those, and every time I pull it out, it's okay. Same thing with the 2210. It's decent, but it's definitely, it's not a 2203. A lot of amps suffer from not being a 2203. So yeah, they've made so many great amps over the years. I've still never done a demo with a Jubilee either, so I'd love to do that. The new kind of studio vintage amps look amazing as well and get some rave reviews. And of course, there's so many great amps based off classic Marshalls. So, I've got a Cherrytone Molecular, which I love the sound of. There's Friedman's, there's the Mark Cameron modded amps, there's stuff like the JMP1 is great as well, and their power amps. Friend of the channel, Troy Nababan, has one of the 9000 series power amps, which sounds pretty amazing as well. So yeah, I think Marshall, like Boogie, have put out some duds over the years, but when you look at the classic amps they've put out, they literally wrote the book for rock guitar tones, and so many people have used those circuits as a basis for creating their own classic amps as well, that you can't really imagine the sound of guitar without the sound of Marshall amps, can you? So you got to let me know what's your favorite Marshall in the video comments on here, and if you own one of them, if you've owned one of them, share your little story about it, because I always love reading those comments, and I'm sure people who like to read the comments will enjoy them too. How do I adjust pickups? A lot of the time I don't. If I get a guitar, whether it's a new guitar or a used guitar, or it's one of my guitars hanging on the wall here and I play it and it sounds good, I don't even think about the pickups. It's just like, oh, that has a cool sound. It's obviously set up right. I want to say, if you asked me this question 10 years ago, I would have been like, well, I'd try it and then I'd do this to the pickups. And I've become someone who tweaks a lot less on guitars. Having said that, I'll use this guitar, which is the closest one to me at the moment. This is a Harley Benton Dullahan. Generally, what I check is if you fret the high string at the 12th fret, you just basically make sure that the neck pickup and the bridge pickup aren't touching the string when you do that. That's a pretty good rule of thumb. You can then measure a specific distance. I've seen a few other websites and guides on there which talk about, several millimeters or whatever percentage of an inch you want to talk about. Same thing on the bass side as well. Go through, hold down the highest fret on there and just check that the pickups aren't touching the string. What I actually like to do if I am setting up pickups or adjusting them is then just do it by ear. I understand that some people like measurements to go off, but at the end of the day, my ears are going to tell me the best place for these pickups. So it's pretty easy to adjust them with a screwdriver and like just keep playing an A chord or something like that until you hear what you like. And then from there, again, by ear, I'll just kind of balance out the sort of perceived output of the bridge and the neck pickup on there. And if I'm on a Strat or something where you can like get really cool sounds in positions 2 and 4, again, I'll sit there and just kind of tweak the heights on there. But it's not really something I do too much. Basically, once I've done it, it's set and forget, and you can kind of use that as a little hack guide in there. I'm not setting up guitars professionally or anything like that. I'm just setting them up for me. And to me, the most important is that they sound good and they play good. And I'm pretty confident doing that with my ears. This one comes from friend of the channel, Tim, asking about how I would dial in a delay in an amps effects loop for an 80s rock kind of sound. There's a couple of delay times that I always go to. There's like 250-ish millisecond kind of thing where you don't want a specific rhythmic effect, but you want a bit of space on there. The 300 to 400 millisecond delay range when you want a rhythmic delay effect, and then maybe like a 600 to 700 millisecond delay if you want a longer lead delay in there. Also, if you've got the option to roll off some of the high end from the repeats on your delay with a tone control or a high cut, I find that generally works pretty well because a lot of my favorite rock delay sounds are from tape echoes or analog echoes where they weren't necessarily very bright sounding, especially when you're running them in the loop. I find that way it kind of just glues the sound together rather than like clashing with the sound. Of course, if you wanted a more rhythmic effect, go for a brighter delay with a very low level and low repeats and put it in front of your amp. But generally, I like delay post distortion, which is why I have a giant rack over here with a PCM 70 and an Eventide, two Eventides actually, and a 2290, because those things all have their own character going on when it comes to delay. The dual delay thing can be really cool as well. You know, the Van Halen like 400, 800 millisecond thing, or you can do the like 75% ratio between the delays, like go 300 and 400 milliseconds for that like Andy Timmons style Halo thing. But I think that really sounds best when you're playing in stereo. So that's what I would go for those kind of things. And again, it's all adjust to taste. Some people like a little bit of delay. Some people like a lot of delay on there. You've got stuff like the 2290, which offers you a ducker as well. And most modern delay pedals will give you that option. So you can have your repeats really loud when you're not playing and really quiet when you are. If I was going to grab a pedal to do that kind of thing, the Boss DD8 is fantastic. The Strymon Dig does the 80s rack delay thing amazingly well. And the Eventide Rose sounds amazing and can do some really cool sound on sound and pitch style stuff as well. I've got videos with all of those. Actually, not the DD8. That one is coming, so look out for that one. But that's what I would recommend for great sounding delays. You can stick in your amp's effects loop, have a great time. One last one for this week. I did a vlog a couple of weeks ago about my trip to Melbourne, and I kept mentioning that in Perth, we say, oh, we're going over East. We're going to go over East and play. We're going to go on tour over East. What do people over East say when they want to come to Perth and Western Australia? I have no idea. I think a lot of people on the East Coast probably like to just casually forget that Western Australia is where it is. You know, Australia is a massive continent, about the size of the continental US. And you can think of Perth as being similar to where San Diego is. And then, you know, Melbourne would be your, I don't know, whatever's in Florida. Maybe Melbourne is Melbourne, Florida. And then Sydney is going to be the Carolinas. And then the Gold Coast is kind of going to be your New York and things like that. All upside down weather-wise, of course, because things are backwards here, including the way the toilets flush. I digress. I always try to get a Simpsons joke in there. I've no idea. I'd say, you know, out west sounds pretty good, or going to Perth. But then again, a lot of people on the East Coast look at the map and they go, why would I want to fly 5 hours to go somewhere where I can fly a couple of hours and, you know, I can go up to Queensland and go to the Barrier Reef and go to Cairns and the Gold Coast, or I can go down to Melbourne and do all those kind of things. So that's sort of the way Australia is set up. And I think a lot of people in Perth like that. There's a lot of people who grew up over East. For example, my parents who moved here in the 80s because they wanted to get away from everything, and Perth was pretty isolated then. It still kind of remains pretty isolated. So, yeah, good old Perth. I would say out west, though. You know, we're going out west. Or you could say G'day from WA. There were a lot of T-shirts printed with that, and if you've got one, let me know in the comments because I want one. That is it for this week's Q&A. Thanks so much for watching. If you've got a question for next week, put it in the comment section below. And I hope you have a great week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.